After the Civil War, Southern blacks, now free from their bondage to the plantations, drifted into the major cities of the South, becoming a formidable percentage of the urban population. Their wanderings did not end, however. Blacks continued to migrate to city centers throughout the latter decades of the 19th century. Even with their migrations, blacks remained the most numerous in the rural South. Fraser estimates that 9/10 of all blacks lived in the South until World War I, and 4/5 of those remained in rural regions. After the First World War, however, the demographic distribution of blacks in the United States shifted northward. The war offered opportunities for unskilled workers not simply because of factory demands, but because the war had disrupted the steady flow of European immigration. Blacks were needed to fill the growing demand for industrial labor. By 1945, 2/3 of blacks lived in urban centers. Those blacks migrating to the north faced challenges that came to rival those they faced in antebellum South and during the Reconstruction. This crisis was a crisis of community and adaptation to segregated life in the North and the South. As Fraser put it, the movement of blacks to cities created a crisis similar to that resulting from emancipation. It was a crisis in that it uprooted the masses of African Americans from their customary way of life, destroying the social organization which represented both an accommodation to conditions in the rural South and an accommodation to their segregated and inferior status in Southern society. You might say that this was a double displacement. That is, blacks came from Africa. They were displaced from their traditions. Slavery became the new reality, but once slavery ended, there was another displacement into a society that did not welcome them. This was the emergence of the period known as Jim Crow, in which segregation became the normal life of most blacks in the South. 20th century urban society was not conducive to communal structures. Blacks, embedded in churches and the invisible institution, were finding it difficult to hold on to traditional supports. That is, those supports did not exist in urban centers or in the urban North. As Fraser writes further, in the cold, impersonal environment of the city, the institutions and associations which had provided security and support for the blacks in the rural environment could not be resurrected. In fact, in the crowded slums of northern cities, neighborliness and friendship no longer had any meaning. Blacks could not find even the warmth and sympathy of secret fraternal organizations which had added color and ornament to a drab existence in the South. Furthermore, the most important crisis in the life of the African American migrant was produced by the absence of the church, which had been the center of his social life and a refuge from a hostile white world. You'll remember the invisible institution becomes an institution in which blacks rely heavily upon for economic, social, as well as educational and political needs. The black church was not only the organization that had created cohesion among the slaves, but it was also the basis of organized life among blacks who were free before the Civil War and among the freedmen following emancipation. The invisible institution, even the institutional church of the rural South, could not meet the demands of urban life. It could not mediate the experience of black families in an urban setting, which, for all its racism, was far more equal a place than the rural South. One unintended consequence of this was the secularization of the black churches. That is, the black churches became this worldly in their outlook and focus. The most noticeable change became the church's interest in community affairs, especially in the move towards civil rights. Religion became one aim among many in the urban black churches. An interesting development in black religion during this period of time, roughly from the 1890s to the 1930s, is the development of what became known as the storefront churches. These were churches that were located in poorer, unkempt sections of the city. You might say that as blacks moved into the inner cities, whites and others moved into the suburbs. Abandoning many of these stores, the stores became available for churches to use as if they were churches. That is to say, blacks could not build their own churches, so instead they used what was available, empty stores. They would rent the empty stores and hold their church services in them. Many of the ministers, however, were semi-literate, and they were not schooled in the Bible or in theology. But that did not matter because the ministers would become more or less a community leader interested in the welfare of blacks. Many of these storefront churches were connected to Baptist churches, but still others were connected to the Holiness, Pentecostal, and even spiritualist churches that were developing in the black community at the time. Fraser does have a comment to say about the storefront churches. He says, the storefront church represents an attempt on the part of the migrants, especially from the rural areas of the South, to reestablish a type of church in the urban environment to which they were accustomed. They want a church, first of all, in which they are known as people. In the large church, they lose their identity completely, and neither the church members nor the pastor knows them personally. The desire for the warmth and intimate association of fellow worshipers in church services was not the only reason why the storefront church was more congenial to the recently urbanized black than the cold, impersonal atmosphere of the large denominational city church. In these small storefront churches, the black migrant could worship in a manner to which he had been accustomed. You might say that the storefront churches became the visible expression of the invisible institution. The invisible institution being imported from the South to the North as blacks migrated northward. There are two main examples that I'd like to talk about of the storefront churches resembling the invisible institution, but also of the storefront churches being the social life of many blacks living in the inner city. The first example is Father Divine and his Peace Mission movement. The second is Sweet Daddy Grace and his United House of Prayer.